You are listening to the Mary Jane Society podcast, where you will meet entrepreneurs, cultivators, inventors, creators, and leaders in the cannabis industry.
I'm your host, Pam Schmiel, marketer and publicist in the cannabis industry. Sensory science is the next step to elevate product development for cannabis brands. Today we meet Dr. Ed S. He's an expert in sensory science and head of product development at Cambium Analytica, where he partners with cannabis brands to create products based on sensory science. He's also created one of the first Cannabis Aroma Lexicons to help brands develop unique standout products. He tells us that terpenes are just one class of hundreds of aroma-active compounds in cannabis. Let's meet Dr. Ed. Welcome to the Mary Jane Society podcast.
Happy to be here.
You're coming from Michigan?
That's right. Yep. I'm based in Ypsilanti, and that's where I'm currently at right now recording this.
So I guess we'll just start with, right, if you can explain to us the Cannabis Aroma Lexicon created to categorize cannabis cultivars.
It's a really exciting time to be a cannabis brand. There's so much potential. And coming from the food science world, I was really fascinated by cannabis as a consumer product. When I was in grad school, I studied commodities, fruits and vegetables, beans, tomatoes, and lettuce, and each of these little commodities has their own sort of internal government that like the Michigan Bean Commission that's looking at how to improve bean quality and appellation and all these different factors that the bean industry might be interested in. And when I got to Cambium Analytica, when I was asked to develop the sensory program, I realized that there's really not that sort of industry-wide collective goal of developing the quality metrics for the industry. And when I was working in grad school, they knew their products so intimately. They would know if their tomato that they developed was like perfect size for the industry standard slicing mechanism, and therefore it was like super suitable for fresh salad tomatoes. And we just are so in our infancy still, that we don't have a lot of that intuition as an industry. And I think we are really interested in contributing to that by developing quality metrics. And the best way to do that is with sensory science. And for me, as someone who studied a lot of those vegetables, this is a really unexplored continent of sensory science. It's a really diverse plant, cannabis, and there's so much to begin to understand about it. And there's so little that's been done, and it's really exciting to just dig in and find all these different factors that might influence liking of cannabis. And we started as just a really small team of just me and my co-author Shelby Suslinski, and we just started by talking to people about what they liked or didn't like about cannabis. And we would just bring in these small groups of employees and chat with them for an hour or so a week, looking at different cannabis buds and saying, what do you like this? What does it smell like to you? Starting to get a feel for how they're describing it and what they're looking at, what catches their eye and what doesn't. And these panels were they were really revealing about how both people who had smoked cannabis for a long time and people who really hadn't had any experience with cannabis interact with the product. And I remember one person, our lovely HR director, she's not a cannabis user, and she described one of them as smelling very positively, just like her grandpa's couch. And that really stuck with me, because it was like this little vivid memory had been unlocked just by smelling this piece of cannabis. And I feel like there's such an opportunity to use that in branding. So we knew we had to start working on a cannabis aroma lexicon at that point, and just to help other people find that experience and have that vivid, experience with cannabis. It's such a great opportunity.
And people have been I've been reading and hearing, people have been talking about it, especially in the wine country in Northern California. They're talking about making, I guess, would you make it into an appellation, or is it, how's that phrased when it's?
Yeah, an appellation usually is like a designation for like a district where something is grown, and I don't think we're quite there yet, because a lot of that comes from understanding the sort of the terroir of the region, and I think cannabis is we start at step one, which is sort of figure out what we like about cannabis and what we kind of want to think is important, and that might distinguish one growing place from another. There's not currently, you might say, okay, we grow this at the same cultivar in Michigan and California, and they're different. How? Like, why is that interesting? So I think we have to kind of back up and say, what are the things that make cannabis cultivars unique from one another? And that's such like it's a long journey to get there. And like I said, with tomatoes, they've had centuries to look at this stuff, and they've got a really good sense of when they have something that's truly unique. And in cannabis, it's a little more haphazard, just because it's such a nascent industry.
Yeah.
And even now, it's interesting you mentioned appellation, because one of the things we did with that first kind of 6 months of just chatting with people about cannabis was we would bring in cultivars of the same name and show them all. We would bring in like a Blue Dream cannabis cultivar and say, what does it smell like to you, without telling them it was Blue Dream. And it was interesting. We would bring like 3 different ones in, and they would smell and say, this is super garlicky, and the next one would be super skunky, or then the next one would be very herbal. And so there's 3 strains with the same name, and they all smelled different, and none of them smelled like what you might expect the strain to smell like based on your own research on Google. So that was like, there's right now there's just not enough control over what these different the genetics of the plants are, that we would reliably be able to do any type of appellation. We'll get there, but right now it's sort of the Wild West. And
right
that was another reason that's kind of like we really wanted to develop this lexicon to help. Those 3 strains were good, they just weren't being described in a way that resonated with the people who are smelling them. So it's just a great opportunity to you don't have to call it Blue Dream just because genetically it's like that right now. There's no regulation that's stipulating that, so you can.
Why is it called Blue Dream? Why are they naming these strains these crazy names?
They're basing it off of which plants had been hybridized over the many years in the black market. And Blue Dream it's some genetic line that at one point maybe had blueberry aroma, but has since been hybridized and moved around to different terroirs and different locations and grown in different ways. There's all these other effects that are now you have 2 that came from the same genetic line, but they're substantially different in their phenotype. So that's kind of how we got to that. And yeah, we just have to kind of rein it in and
re-identify.
Regroup,
yes,
re-identify. Yeah, and it's a big effort to do that, but the only way we could really start to do that is by then doing these formal evaluations of the cannabis plant and saying what is it presenting, and what do we see consistently in this group of genetics that warrants a categorization, if that makes sense.
Well, I guess that kind of leads into the next question, is what are the challenges of creating a cannabis lexicon? And that seems like one of the challenges is, how are you going to set the standards and the naming and the distinctions? Like, what is, that seems to be the obvious to me, but what do you think?
I think that a lot of that's up to the industry. What we're really looking at with the lexicon is providing a means for them to even measure the properties of cannabis at all, which is difficult and is important eventually to then start to classify cannabis. And one of probably the biggest challenge we run into is how do we balance inclusivity of people's sort of verbal descriptions of these cannabis samples, and then the usability of the tool. So, for example, you might have, a cannabis plant that smells vaguely fruity, and one person might say it smells like apple. Another person might say it smells like peach. 20 people can smell it, and they might all have different specific aromas, and so you get this spread of different fruit, and it's very hard to pick one and say, okay, this is what we should focus our brand on. But you also can't say, fruity is not specific enough to develop a brand around either. So trying to find that sweet spot where, I think in this example, you could go with something like orchard, where that will resonate with the person who smelled apple and the person who smelled peach, but still be unique enough to build a brand around. So it's finding, helping people to come to a common language that describes it so it resonates with the most amount of people. So then when someone goes to the dispensary and says, I'd like something with a bit of an apple, they can be the bud tender could then provide them something that is in that orchard category or some different ones, and then they can have that individual, because you might think an apple smells like a peach and other people might think they're really different. There's a lot of personal variation between the way we perceive aromas. It's very psychological, and there's a lot of hedonics liking that goes into that. So it's really important to find that sweet spot where you have a branding opportunity, but you aren't going so specific that you're alienating people either.
Right. And I guess maybe eventually the idea is to get this cannabis lexicon well known enough and accepted that people naming these new strains, because these strains are just going to be, different versions are going to be coming out, different breeds and hybrids. So it's going to be an ongoing problem. So I guess your job is to get this really accepted and set up some sort of system that eventually the breeders and the cultivators will refer to this. I guess that's the idea as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the breeders, they'll want to refer to it so they're not growing a bunch of overlapping strains, and the producers too they don't want to cannibalize their own sales by selling exclusively fruity options. They want to have different options for different market segments, and you can't do that if you don't categorize them in some way. But right now, in the absence of any guidance, I think it's inevitable that a lexicon will have to be adopted eventually. I think there are a lot of sort of proposed lexicons, and of course the terpenes is kind of what's filled the vacuum right now, but that's not going to be sustainable. And we may talk about that in more detail, but there's going to need to be a lexicon. As soon as a lexicon that resonates with consumers becomes available, it will be adopted. There's such a need for that in this product that I think it's inevitable.
So this lexicon is just for aroma?
So it's basically a lexicon is like a list of all these words that we've determined through our experimentation to be good at describing cannabis. So they're commonly used to describe cannabis. They are repeatedly measurable in certain instances, and then it comes with each word in that lexicon having its own definition, and then some reference that we can say, okay, if you're not sure what peach smells like, go buy this peach and smell it, and like that's the sort of standard definition. And that's something that we're continuing to build out as our lexicon is not static, right? We want it to be ever evolving. We want people to contribute, and we even find, we publish this wheel, and we're already finding instances where there's stuff we'd like to add, stuff we'd like to consolidate, or stuff that's being used in different ways by different consumers. So it's really important that we continue to grow it, basically. And other industries like the coffee industry have done this extremely well. They spent a lot of time over many years growing their lexicon, and you mentioned it being just for aroma. I think that's true right now when we're talking about this specific lexicon, but the words we use to describe cannabis will grow beyond just aroma, even though I think aroma is probably one of the more important sensory attributes of cannabis. Texture, visuals, appearance, and even some slight oral stuff. When you squeeze it, you might hear crackling. We use all our senses to taste food, and it's not terribly different for cannabis.
So I guess that's the other question is there a relationship between the physiological and sensory effects of cannabis? So I know there are some strains that say they help make you sleepy, and some of the cannabinoids in there, the CBN is supposed to make you sleepy and things like that. CBG, relaxing, I guess. So it has to do with the compounds in the plant as well. But what about the sensory? Is that affecting the physiological effect?
There was a really amazing paper by Jerry Plum and his team called "The Nose Knows," and it described how the pleasurability of the experience of consuming cannabis was really dependent on whether they liked the aroma. So that, regardless of the potency of the plant. So it suggests that there is a relationship between how the experience feels to you and the aroma. I think that very little is known about the sort of physiological mechanisms that actually are happening that produce these effects, but they appear to be really interpersonal, very personal, very related to your own biology. And I think right now what we know is that whether or not all these certain botanicals work in a certain way is maybe not as important as the actual whether you like the smell of it. And so I think it warrants focusing on that and less on the sort of the entourage effect that we pursue. And even then, when you're looking at potency too, it appears that potency is not even a good predictor of how much of a high you get. Interestingly, you would of course expect that, but it appears that the aroma actually is contributing to the feeling of highness, and in a significant way. So there definitely is a relationship. I think it's just something that we're only just beginning to understand, and in the meantime, I think it's something that you just can't discount the huge effect that aroma is going to have on that experience.
Well, so you're basically against like a lot of the CPG brands, came out trying to identify or stand out with their products by claiming that this strain will make you sleepy, this will make you energetic, this you should use this to exercise on, this blah 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 blah. So you're saying it should not be it shouldn't be described that way, or maybe they're just missing a piece of. What do you think?
I think that it's just a bit premature to say that a lot of times they'll present the top 3 terpenes, right, and say these are the defining parts of this plant. Let's just say like a top terpene is pinene and myrcene. Well, how do you reconcile that? Pinene is sort of associated with alertness and myrcene is associated with sedation. So are you just alert and sleepy? Like the terpenes and their association with the effects is, I think, mediated by sort of the psychology of it. And it's important, with a sample that has pinene and myrcene, it might smell like garlic. Those top terpenes, pinene smelling more like kind of woody and pine-like, and myrcene being a little floral and sour. Like there is, it might not smell like that just because those are the top terpenes, because terpenes are not the only aroma compounds that contribute to this. There's hundreds of aroma compounds that are contributing to the aroma. So if you go as a consumer to buy a plant that has high pinene and myrcene, hoping it will be pine-like and woody, and then you get garlic, you're going to be betrayed. You're going to feel disappointed, and because we're not even looking at the sulfur compounds in there that would be causing that skunkiness. And I just think that when you present it as the top 3 terpenes, the potency, it tells sort of a misleading story about what the product is. where you would be better off as a brand to tell what it really smells. If it does smell like garlic, say that it smells like garlic. It doesn't matter what the terpenes are. Really, the experience is of garlic. And if you like garlic, buy this strain.
I see. Okay, you're misleading them. Right. So it's so interesting too, because you are talking about terpenes effectively. I mean, right? But now you're kind of saying this whole aroma lexicon is deeper than that, than the terpenes that we're just talking about. There's so many other factors. You just mentioned sulfite, blah, blah, blah.
Well, yeah, terpenes are just one class of hundreds of aroma-active compounds, aldehydes, ketones, sulfite. Like there's hundreds of different aroma compounds that are not terpenes that are very much present in cannabis and very defining too. I mean, recently a paper came out that showed that the thiols were the main sort of contributor to that skunky aroma that's typically associated with cannabis, and that's not ever reported to the consumer. I'm not sure that it needs to be, but to know that it's skunky is that consumer does want to know that.
Yeah, yeah. And also down the road now, I mean, well, in New York anyway, we're allowed to smoke on the street. Anywhere you can smoke cigarettes, you can smoke in New York. And it's become, very fragrant out there. And that's a big, huge complaint, but in other cities, states, you're not allowed to do that, So, but it's going to happen. There's going to be an aroma problem that people are going to really complain about and I just feel like maybe that could be something in the breeders' minds down the road is controlling all these different things that you're saying to make it more tame. Well, look, I guess, I don't know. That's just kind of crazy, but
I think you've really touched on something though, in that there can be different cannabis products that align themselves with different contexts. And we really as an industry are failing to do that right now. So if you know you have a very skunky product, you can market it for those sort of at-home use or somewhere like, you can either play that up, highlight it, or not highlight it, almost obscure it. And at the same time, if you have something that smells really like strawberry jam or something, you can say like, this is an excellent strain to smoke socially because it's widely acceptable. It's something that won't turn people, like, it's not divisive. Like skunkies can be divisive, right? Some people like it, but some people really don't like it. So if you know what you have, you say, okay, my strain is unique because it doesn't have any of those thiols and that skunkiness, and then use that in your branding. Say this is a benefit of our product that differentiates, is that this is a great social smoke. And so again, by knowing what you have, there's so many ways to do that. I mean, even with texture, let's say that, okay, these buds are very sticky, perfect for hand grinding to pack into a bowl, not so much to put into your grinder, it's going to clog it up. Again, knowing what you have, a very sticky product, then you can highlight how it can be used by the consumer for the best experience.
Yeah. There's a lot to it. I'm not sure if I understand this question. Can you elaborate on the findings from your study about in the citrus, tropical floral type odors, you say yield higher liking scores from your studies? And whereas certain biological, packaging, and agricultural odors may penalize that. And then what do you mean by that?
So in the study, we do say that essentially these certain types of odors are associated with people liking it more, and certain types of odors are associated with people liking it less. I think that it's very important to caution people from saying that, okay, the market just wants fruity tropical citrus stuff. That's not necessarily true. It just means that the market tends to have a majority of people who lean that direction. What we do basically is we ask them to check all the boxes that apply, and we look at the people who did check tropical and compare them against the people who did not, and we say, okay, the people who did check tropical like these samples more, in simple terms. But even if 75% of the market prefers fruity aromas, that's still 25% of the market and that's a huge chunk. That's huge, that you could market a non-fruity one to. You just have to, if you know that you're not going to be marketing towards, the majority, then you can target the specific minority that's really looking for your product. So I don't want it to be interpreted like, okay, these packaging and these biological type aromas, which tend to be sort of like cardboardy or skunky, with biological tends to describe like skunky or sort of like sweaty type aromas, and those, there is a market for them. It's just a different market than the folks who are looking for something more food-like. And so it's more like a step towards understanding the market as a whole, and to start to develop a sense of where the segments are that we could specifically target a product towards, and how big those segments are. So right now, if I looked at my study, I'd say there's a pretty big market for fruity, but in that sense, you might have a lot more competition. You might have a harder time targeting specific groups, whereas the smaller market that's looking for non-fruity ones, you might have an easier time resonating with them, especially if the product you're already growing is skunky, right? Then you kind of have to, lean into your strengths, right, as a brand. And so this is just, I always worry that people will look at that and say, oh, I better start growing tropical strains. It's not necessarily the case.
Right. So does the lexicon also, so that's part of the lexicon, is showing where the consumer interest is based on your focus groups? Is that giving?
Well, we try to keep the two worlds separate. So the two worlds being the kind of objective descriptions of the plant, and then the consumer's pleasure associated with that. So they're really two different things, right? What we want to do is describe it as objectively as possible, and then let the brands interpret that and use it to target specific consumer liking groups. Now, we did ask about liking in our study, because we wanted to start exploring that, but it's not something that should happen simultaneously, right? They should occur kind of separately, where you first, know what you have, and then give it to consumers and start to measure who it's really resonating with and what strategies you can use to improve that resonance. Mm-hmm. Maybe you figure out first with descriptive that you have this very aptly strain, and then you brand it in 3 different ways, and you give that to consumers, and you find out what resonates with them. Those are kind of, in my eyes, the steps that you might take, the 2 levels of sensory, that first the descriptive work sensory, and then the consumer sensory that you might apply to optimize your brand's success.
Let's talk about the opportunities of sensory science, where brands can use it to create luxury brands. And I mean, you're kind of giving us some good examples of how to look at it differently than we've all been looking at it, and just I feel everybody's going down that same road of identifying the terpenes. You're really opening it up to be a lot more complex. So can you walk us through the steps? Like, if you had a new client that is looking to build a luxury brand, what would you say to them? How would you start breaking that down for them, or get them thinking? Maybe it's kind of what you were really just talking about.
Yeah, I think the first step is, what about your product is premium? I mean, you can say like, we grow it really well, or we have all these,
Everybody says that.
Exactly. So what specifically about your product makes it unique and interesting? Let's just say you're growing something that's, I ran into a strain recently that was green on the outside. When you opened it up, it was sort of like a pink purple on the inside. I was like, wow, I don't know anything about why. I don't know why that would happen in the grow process, but it was really unique and eye-catching. And it doesn't matter if it's like, some people will say, if you just Google around, like, what makes premium quality cannabis premium, and they'll have 100 different things, and a lot of them will contradict. They'll be, oh, you want it to be leafy, you want it to be sticky, you want it to be purple, but none of those they're just anecdotal. And the question is, if you have a unique feature, let's just say your flower is very pink on the inside, how do you highlight that and say, here's this really unique, cool flower? And by highlighting those unique bits, you kind of already are positioning yourself as a luxury product just by differentiating yourself. and you can charge more for those features. So you're on your way to a luxury product already. So first step is knowing, most cannabis cultivars that I've encountered have at least one thing about them that is particularly stand out, right? Some of them will be very, very frosty on the outside. They'll be nearly white, and it's like, in the branding of that, how do you communicate that? And why do you communicate that? Is frostiness, to you, what do you like about the frostiness? And then if you understand why you like frostiness, you can eventually build that into a brand to show, help people who also like frostiness find your product. And I think that's a lot of that is on the brand to take that objective descriptive knowledge and creatively turn it into something that people really like. And I think the first step is just being honest with yourself. A lot of people, we've done a few aroma profiles for various things. A lot of people will give them what we measure as the aroma profile. We'll take 30 people, we'll do a descriptive panel. We'll give an aroma, and they'll say, I don't agree. Or I don't think it smells like this. And that's probably genuine. They genuinely might not agree with that. But the reality is, if you get 30 people, blind them to, they don't know anything about this, and they can't even see the product, and they're just smelling it under these very highly controlled conditions. You have to take that data and interpret it, in kind of take yourself out of that equation and turn it into, this is how people are describing it. How can I reconcile what I believe it is and that? And there is a way to do that almost always. You might think, it leans fruity. Well, and maybe people said, smells mostly like lemons, limes, oranges. Like there's a group there that is agreeing with you, but there's also a group that's saying there's something else here. It's leathery. It's like, and you kind of have to take that and turn it into a more holistic idea that appeals to everybody. Maybe taking it back and describing it in terms of the experience or context. Like this is, like an old timey bar. Like it's got the martini in one hand and the smoke in the other, or something, like, describing it in terms of what they're purchasing, which is an experience, right? Yes. And that experience is not one thing to all people, right? So you have to leave a little space for the individual, and that's sort of a difficult thing for a lot of cannabis brands to do. They want it to be objective. They want it to be, this is the aroma of my cannabis, and that's immovable, right?
Well,
but that's, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking as you're describing all this stuff in such detail that I think the answer to the question of, how can they use this to create a luxury brand, is you are still creating this lexicon, and there's going to be so much in-depth and complex information to unpack in the plant that they'll find their answer in there. They've got, that's really what it is once you have that built, that's where they can go digging and all that kind of stuff. So really it's going to open up a whole new brand category, honestly. And so can sensory science be applied to all consumption methods? Like, would it affect anything, like as far as vape, tinctures, edibles? Is there, or is it just a flower thing, the lexicon, or how, does that transfer?
Yeah, well, at first, I think you nailed it with that summary of my previous point. Yeah. And related to, tinctures and vapes, I think that we do look at concentrates, just the general category of concentrates, resins, and we have applied our lexicon to those, and it appears to work really well. A lot of it's very similar aromas. There's a couple special unique sensory things to consider with concentrates, like off aromas from the processing steps that could be something we measure, and whether those things, how they carry over into the actual consumption experience, I think is a whole nother bag of worms that we would be looking at. Okay, the consumer now is beyond the point of purchase. So they've already made the decision to try this product. They take it home and they're interacting with it in all these other different ways that we don't always anticipate. Maybe they're squeezing it, maybe they're using their hands, maybe it's maybe they have a fan on and they don't want it to, there's so many contextual ways that consumers use cannabis that it makes it really hard to sort of say, this is, you're using your arms. I think over time we'll get a feel for, okay, there's, this group of consumers tends to take it home and leave it in a jar, and then when they want to use it, they grind it in a metal grinder, and that's the kind of process. And I think it opens up a great opportunity for people to target those sort of habitual processes that people use at home. And even with flower, you can smoke it or you can vape it, right? So maybe some flower is more suitable for vaporizing. Maybe there are some features of flower that, again, once you start to measure and you have all this data, you say, okay, people really like to vape flower that has this moisture level, that's this amount of squishy, that can be packed into their machine, that works in these ways, and they still have to grind it, so it needs to be grindable. And so identifying, okay, these are the things we believe are perfect for a person who vapes, and then saying our brand is flower for vaping, and then targeting that use type. And I think with edibles, of course, I'm a food scientist at heart, and edibles are great. We can apply the traditional food science techniques to measure all sorts of things about edibles. We do this with gummies all the time with our clients who oftentimes struggle with quality, what quality features to be looking for in gummies, and how to avoid off flavors, how to, do good quality control, make sure they're not releasing gummies with tags, seams, and sensory science. It's exciting to apply to cannabis flower, but we shouldn't forget that it's been used for years to make the best food products. And when you're infusing products, they're no exception. You need to be using sensory science as a quality control method to know what your targets are, what your variance is allowed, and whether your inputs are good. I think a lot of people struggle because they purchase some distillate or some sort of concentrate to use in an edible, and it might vary from purchase to purchase. And there's not very many specifications for, okay, this one tastes a little different. Like, as a producer, that's very frustrating to have an input that's coming in a little different every time. And to develop specifications for, okay, this one has this amount of limited aroma. Again, sensory. You must use sensory to develop these specifications. So there's just, I think it applies to all facets of from the beginning of the production of the product to the consumer using it in their home or anywhere, that sensory has a role that is critical to the success of the product.
To wrap it up, would either, if you want to just talk about, are there any emerging trends or advancements in sensory science that you think would have an impact on the development of any cannabis brand? Honestly, I feel like, again, I feel like I've answered my question. It doesn't have to be luxury focused. It's everything that you're talking about today that presents the opportunity. So I'm just that's where I'll take that. But yeah, so just in general.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the biggest interactions there is the use of software in the home. Traditionally, sensory analysis occurs in a highly controlled setting in a lab, or at some specific location where we think the product might be used. And then there's at-home use testing, which is more ecologically valid, or in other words, representative of the sort of natural context in which this product would be used. And the part, one thing we haven't looked at a lot is sort of the actual smoking experience of it. There's a lot of ethical and regulatory barriers to handing out cannabis and say, go on the survey at home and use it. But there are ways to do, right. We want to make sure, we're not, promoting any harm. but I think as we get better software that's more accessible for someone to just have on their phone and say, I'm smoking this and this is what I'm smelling and feeling, that hasn't been a big focus in the past, when I was in school and in the past couple of decades. And now I see a lot more apps out there that are sensory data collection
Yeah.
software, essentially, that are accessible on a phone and usable by any person to take a sample home and try it and then record responses in their natural environment. And I think that's particularly important in cannabis, where you do have these, especially if you're trying to measure just like the subjective effect that's happening. Like, do you feel sleepy? Like, we think that this combination is promoting sleepiness for a lot of people, but we want to start to collect data on who is it really doing that, and in what context is it failing to do that, and how can we address those problems?
Right. You guys should partner up with one of these apps to add to your lexicon, only because I know one in particular, strain app, strain print is a big one that's out of Canada, and I know they're doing a lot of things. You should check them out. That's just one I know. I've some in the United States, but I know about those guys. And yeah, so they're working within each state, and it's based on consumers giving their feedback on how they feel on a particular product. So then you're getting the ratio of what everybody's using mostly the same thing, 1-to-1, THC, CBD, a little but then there's like 25% of CBG or CBG and all that stuff. So and how it feels, and there's a big focus on the terpenes. But you could honestly, guys, you could open that up more into their app and kind of work together and really create something.
Yeah, absolutely. And we developed our own application at Cambium that has our lexicon, and we want to use that actually to start, because there's a risk too, with just taking lots of big consumer data about stuff. Because it's highly uncontrolled, it requires a very careful interpretation process, so you're not making broad generalizations and promoting misinformation. And I think sites like Leafly or some of those popular review sites can sometimes bias people when you have a strain that's called Blueberry Magic, and then you look down and everyone says it tastes like blueberry. Well, if they didn't know it's called Blueberry Magic, they may have thought differently. And so what I would like to see is a little bit more blind. So my vision would be like giving someone a blinded sample, and then they take it home directly from us, and we kind of control a lot of those variables. We know, like, they're not getting a weird piece, they're getting like something representative of a normal product, and then we can we know that it hasn't been tampered with and that they opened it at this time, and we know how long ago it was produced. So we have some control over not even control, but just knowledge of where it's been, what the product has been through, so that we can make sure we're not interpreting data that isn't really well controlled in a scientific way. We're just, as a sensor scientist, I'm very sensitive about interpreting consumer reviews without taking the proper controls. And
that makes sense. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, that would be a little wild out there, because you really are creating something very kind of scientific and
robust.
Robust. And the last question is, are you the last one? Are you the only ones doing this? Do you know of, or has anyone started creating this?
I think it's very challenging. We're in a unique position as a testing lab to have access to a lot of flower, and we're lucky because we have an awesome leadership team who really supports this mission, and we have a really talented team of food scientists who we all work with to actually develop surveys and administer these highly controlled tests. And it's a big investment. So I'm not surprised that there are not many other research institutions looking at this. There are a couple, I know, and a couple universities are starting to get into it, but of course they run into a lot of barriers that make it really challenging. And we're able to leverage our position to do these studies. I think it's our responsibility as impartial group in the industry to sort of lead this. I think we play a really, Cambium, we really take a lot of pride in the transparency and the trust we build, and we want to contribute to that. That's why we released this lexicon, for free use. It's not, we're not withholding it or asking you to pay for it. It's just this tool. We want adoption of it to make this cannabis industry better.
Yeah, sure. I think this is going to really take us to another level. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. I think consumers are owed it. I mean, they're really eager for this type of, communication.
And for the communication and for the connoisseurs. It's for the connoisseurs.
Absolutely.
Like the people in the industry, we're all ahead of the consumers because we're studying this and we're testing and trying and innovating, but they don't even know what half the stuff we're doing. So wait till they find out, it's it's going to be crazy. And really great to meet you.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you for speaking to me.
Yeah.